Please welcome Katie Porter.
I just want to start by giving a shout out to my fellow Iowan. I grew up in Iowa. I now represent Orange County, California. But in that video clip, I just want to acknowledge my amazing colleague, Cindy Axney, who's a newly elected freshman from Iowa and has to sit next to me in those hearings and deal with my props. The whiteboard, the poster board, whatever it is. And she's very good-natured about it. She told me she's gotten really famous from these videos of sitting next to me. So she's really a terrific colleague. I am so excited to be here today. As we entered the building, I ran into one of my very first law students, who is a longtime member of the ABI and served on the ABI commission. I came down the stairwell and ran into one of my co-authors. I've talked to judges who I've known for a long time and who helped support me in my career. It's pretty rare that I go to an event where I'm more excited to see people than they are to see me. So I just want to say thank you for having me here today. Bankruptcy is one of my favorite things to talk about, and unfortunately, there are not enough opportunities in Congress for me to do that. I've spent my whole career studying bankruptcy, and what I love about it is its endless intellectual challenge, and that is also something that Congress is not particularly known for. I have not been in Congress that long, which is good news for you because I have not learned to talk about myself for 20 minutes. So I'm going to talk about some other things. I haven't picked up the bad habit of just talking about myself the entire time. But I did want to say a couple words about how I came to be interested in bankruptcy. I was a third-year law student, or getting ready to be a third-year law student, and Harvard Law recommended that you take tax. And they had this justification that it's important to learn a statutory code, to learn how to interpret a canon, a statute like that, and how Congress effectuates social policy through statutes. And the good tax teacher wasn't available. I couldn't get into his class. And I didn't want to take a bad tax teacher. And so I decided that I would substitute bankruptcy for tax. And the first day of class, I had Elizabeth Warren, the class met at 8 a.m. sharp. And I remember the speech that she gave to this day. And it was about capitalism and how bankruptcy fits into our capitalist economy. And she talked about the way that capitalism incentivizes risk-taking, how it rewards people who are successful, the supply of credit, why that is so important to maintain. But she said the problem is that there are also just as there are winners in capitalism, and as capitalism rewards those winners, there's no inherent answer in capitalism about what you do for those who take the risk or deal with the downsides of this cycle that is capitalism and stumble or fall, whether they're a large business or an individual. And she said that is what bankruptcy is about. It's about evening out the ups and downs of capitalism, and it's about creating a cushion on the downside. And so growing up on a farm in Iowa, one of my strongest memories is being on the school bus and the bus stopping in the little town square where I lived. And the bus came to a dead stop, traffic jam in a town of 6,000 people. And we were all getting very rowdy on the bus. Why are we not going? Let's go. And I remember some smartass, who might have been me, saying, the people yelling, let's go. And the driver said, the bank is closed. And the smartass said, of course it is. It's 3:30. Everybody knows the bank closes at 3 o'clock because back in the day, those were bankers' hours. But when I got home, what I understood was that the bank had truly closed. And the FDIC had come in on that Friday afternoon and taken over the small town bank in the town that I grew up in. And so I lived through watching people lose their farms, people lose their house, lose their possessions, and sort of seeing, going out of that, as I later sat in that classroom with Elizabeth Warren a couple decades later, seeing Chapter 12 and learning about what that was and how that worked and what that meant to try to address that problem. So for me, the kind of love for bankruptcy came partly out of bankruptcy as a way to understand why these things happen and how we address them and how we can move on. I will confess that when I took bankruptcy class with Warren, I was a third-year law student, and I wasn't really looking to get my ass handed to me every day. I thought I would just, do the work and collect my A. And that didn't really, work out that way with Elizabeth Warren. It was quite a rigorous class, and bankruptcy, as we know, is hard. It's a hard subject to study, and it's one that is worth giving your lifetime to. I remember one day in class, Elizabeth asked a question, and I had done my homework. I was prepared. I was in the front row. And she said, "Ms. Porter," and I gave a great answer. I mean, I had done the reading, I had thought about it, I wanted to be a contributor to this intellectual conversation, and Elizabeth said, "Come on, Miss Porter, think. And I remember just wilting, because I was thinking. I really was. One of the great things about her as a professor was that she never gave up on her students, even those like me that found bankruptcy to be a challenge. And so that course really hooked me on bankruptcy, and I never really looked back. I had the chance to practice bankruptcy law briefly in Portland, Oregon, and then began to do empirical research on bankruptcy, both in law school and then after law school. At the time, there was this raging debate about whether debtors can pay, who can pay, how much can they pay, how should we do that. So all the focus was on why do people file bankruptcy, what reasons bring them to the system, and what circumstances are they in, and how do debtors shape the bankruptcy system. And while I studied those debtors with Elizabeth and did work through the multiple iterations of the Consumer Bankruptcy Project, I think the most transformative sort of moment for me was when I realized how little we knew about the creditors in bankruptcy, what they were doing, what they were trying to accomplish, how they were shaping the system. And so I launched a project looking at how mortgage companies behaved in bankruptcy. The answer was not well, and so to put it gently, and so that research then was part of the conversation that eventually led several years later to the creation of a bankruptcy rule to help make mortgage servicing work better in bankruptcy. And then that work led to what I did with Senator Kamala Harris on foreclosures. Not a lot of people run for Congress to work on Section 727 of the code, but I did. Not a lot of people run for Congress to work on the problems with FHA single-family default servicing, but I did. And so I really ran for Congress to take what I know about how our free market intersects with our legal and regulatory framework and how to make those things work better. One of the things I'm fond of saying in Congress and when I'm with my constituents is that I'm a champion of capitalism that creates opportunity for everyone. And when you understand that that is the goal is capitalism that creates opportunity for everyone, then you understand that things like bankruptcy are an inextricably important part of a capitalist system, because we can't have opportunity for everyone if we don't have a way to lift back up those people or those companies, that human capital, when it gets itself into trouble. So we need to talk about what healthy capital markets look like, what healthy capitalism looks like, and we need to talk about the guardrails that we need to have on capitalism, things like antitrust enforcement. The only people who benefit from monopolies are monopolists. So we should be championing antitrust enforcement across partisan lines because it's going to make our capitalist economy stronger. We should be working on making sure that we have price transparency and we're lowering barriers to competition across our economy. So the idea is to really talk in a way about capitalism that helps people understand that things like consumer protection, things like the rights of investors, to be treated fairly, to understand what they're investing in, to have full and complete information, some of the same principles that you all work on day in, day out as you try to put together and whether it's adjudicate or litigate a bankruptcy case, you are really confronting a lot of the questions that are at the core of how do we create a strong, healthy capitalist economy. And that's really what I love about being on the Financial Services Committee, is that those are the kinds of issues that I get to work on each and every day. A month ago maybe, Purdue filed bankruptcy. And it was pretty early in the morning, and I called up my staffer, and I said, I want to talk about the Purdue bankruptcy filing. And she said, oh, I know, isn't it just terrible? It's horrible. They're going to rip all those consumers off. It's so awful. They're trying to get out of jail free and bankruptcy, blah, blah. And I said, Kaylee, I suggest you stop talking now. I said, Kaylee, I know you're a lawyer, and I think I already know the answer to this, but you didn't take bankruptcy, did you? And she said, no, maybe I should have. And I was like, yeah, you should have. And so one of the things we tried to do was use my expertise in bankruptcy to explain to the public, and this, by the way, is exactly what I was doing when I was a professor. It's just a different audience and a different kind of venue in which I'm having this conversation, is to explain to people that bankruptcy has the tremendous potential to provide a more equitable outcome for those who have been wronged, that bankruptcy is there to safeguard the rights of all of the creditors of Purdue Pharmacy and of the Sacklers. It's there to provide transparency and public participation in something that otherwise could be a private process. And so kind of understanding what that means and talking about that bankruptcy is not a get-out-of-jail-free card. It is instead an opportunity to pause, to bring everyone together who is interested in the outcome of the case, from an individual creditor to a state agency to a bondholder, and have a collective public conversation in a transparent way about how we're going to address the claims of those who are owed money and how we're going to be able to move forward for that company. And I think having that perspective in Congress is really important. There is, I believe, one other bankruptcy person in Congress, besides Elizabeth in the Senate, in the House. And so Ed Perlmutter is a comfort to me, and that he's the other person who knows something about bankruptcy. And so we enjoy working on this. But one of the challenges for you all to think about is the jurisdictional one that we face in committees. Bankruptcy is in the purview of the Judiciary Committee because it's a court process. And the people who sign up to be on the Judiciary Committee are people who want to work on gun violence prevention, on immigration. They want to work on impeachment. This is who goes there. The people who go to the Judiciary Committee don't want to work on bondholder rights. They don't want to work on the definition of a claim. We see the exact same things with student loans, by the way. So student loans are in the province of the Education and Labor Committee, but nobody loves a good $1.5 trillion hot mess like the Financial Services Committee, right? And so this committee jurisdiction is one of the things that I think sometimes hampers our ability to have the right kinds of policy making and the right kinds of focus and attention on areas like bankruptcy. And so in financial services, we spend a lot of time thinking about how do we create healthy capital markets? How do we make sure there's enough capital out there, but how do we make sure at the same time that we're not overheating the economy, that we're protecting investors, protecting consumers, giving them both information that they need to make good decisions? That is not what they think about in the Education and Labor Committee on a regular basis. And so when you get to something like student loans, and we're talking about the process of securitizing student loans and underwriting them and the spread between the Treasury rate and what we're charging borrowers, the Ed and Labor people are really interested in kindergarten curriculum, in the right of workers to organize, really important issues, but they're not necessarily financial ones. And so that is one of the, I think, interesting things to me about Congress, is how that jurisdictional assignment sometimes doesn't bring all of the right players into the conversation at the same time, which I think is really important. I have really, really enjoyed being in Congress so far. Somebody asked me, do you just love it? What I would say is that I absolutely love the work. It is the most important work I have ever had the privilege to do. The job sucks. The commute's terrible. The hours are long, the colleagues vary wildly, and the job security is not so good. So I'm constantly balancing kind of this work that I love with the friction of this job that is just really, really, really challenging. But I do feel fortunate that I get to take and tackle some of the problems that I worked on as an academic, some of the problems that I saw as a practitioner, some of the problems that I worked on collectively with you all, and then try to work on them and making them come into law. So we're working right now on developing a statutory proposal that would take what the ABI Consumer Commission proposed with regard to filing attorney's fees, in Chapter 7, and trying to turn that into a statute. People should be choosing Chapter 13 and Chapter 7 based on what's going to give them the help that they need. And what's going to allow them to achieve their goals in bankruptcy, not based just on the cash on hand they have in the moment. And so to be able to work on some of these issues that I studied, that I learned about from many of people in this room, is really a pleasure. People ask me why I ran for Congress. And there are a lot of answers to that question. But one of them was that I couldn't figure out how to get off the ABI Consumer Commission gracefully. And this seemed like a really, really good way off the commission. So while I wholeheartedly supported its work, it says something about the tremendous undertaking that the ABI and so many of you in this room did, that I thought running for a seat that was last held by a Democrat in the 1930s seemed like it would be less work. And so I want to thank you all for all of the hard work that you do, both on that commission, but also day in, day out in the lives of people. Whether it's a CEO of a large company who's potentially facing liability and job loss and shareholder action, to a senior who's overwhelmed with predatory debt. You are in people's lives every single day, making a real difference, and you are inspiring them to believe that there is justice and that there is fairness, and that our system is hard at work balancing the competing interests of debtors and creditors, and that is really important, really meaningful work. So while I often say that I am a consumer advocate and a law professor and a mother of 3 lightly supervised children, it is also true that I am a bankruptcy nerd and damn proud of it. Thank you all very much, and I'm happy to take questions. So there are 2 microphones, and I'm going to take questions till Sam says we're out of time. So feel free. Don't be shy. Yes, Judge Weedoff. Oh, student loans, yeah. So, student loans has been a real source of frustration for me. The Financial Services Committee has jurisdiction over private student loans, which are a dwindling problem, thankfully. And we have jurisdiction over some of over the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. So I have a bill that would require the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to maintain the student loan ombudsman, and would require the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to get data from loan servicers so that they can take a look at what's really happening. A lot of what I see happening on the servicing side of student loans parallels what I saw with mortgage servicers. So you get different answers every time you call. You're not given the workout plan that is best for you. There are competing incentives that those servicers are dealing with. And so that is a bill that we have that we hope we can move to the floor and actually get passed into law. On the origination side, and just the sheer magnitude of the debt overhang in this country, that is a problem that I frankly do not see my colleagues wanting to take up and squarely address, and I think that's a real loss. The economic studies on sort of widespread loan forgiveness or reduction are pretty clear that we collectively as taxpayers would gain more than we would lose from forgiving a broad chunk of student loan debt. In terms of bankruptcy, this won't surprise you, Judge, because you know me pretty well. I think, while I do not think there is a rational, principled basis for treating things like private student loans different than other kinds of commercial debt like credit cards, I can't look out at young people in this country and tell them that the best help I can give them is a one-way ticket to bankruptcy. We have to have a more meaningful answer than potentially putting tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of students into bankruptcy to get help. So while I'm supportive of the idea of adjusting the bankruptcy law on this point, I'm also wary of my colleagues saying, we adjusted bankruptcy law, we did something, look, we're Congress and we actually did something, and therefore we don't have to do something about the other 1.499 trillion that will not go through bankruptcy, but is still out there creating a drag on our economy. So one of the things I did is I formed a college affordability caucus, because one of the things I think that as you hear presidential candidates talking about different kinds of loan forgiveness and how we might address student loans, what nobody's talking about is that the sticker price of college is too high, period. So we are backfilling with scholarships, we are backfilling with debt, but at the end of the day, the price needs to be cheaper. So the median income family needs to be able, and then the student who's willing to work their way through college need to be able to get through at least our state universities, if not a lot of our private schools, in a way that does not saddle them with either debt or leave them begging for scholarship money. And so it doesn't do us a lot of good to look and I don't need to tell this to a group of bankruptcy lawyers. You all look retrospectively all the time and say, gee, that contract doesn't seem like such a good deal anymore. We have to do that, but we also have to think prospectively about what's going to happen to the next group of 18-year-olds. And any kind of debt forgiveness that we do, if we're just back in the same place in 10 years or 15 years, that's a huge problem. And I don't hear that conversation happening. And that is particularly a conversation that can and should be happening in the Education and Labor Committee. And again, I'm not seeing that willingness, and it's frustrating. The kind of jurisdictional limits on how Congress operates sometimes allow some of the most pressing issues to fall through the cracks. And I think student debt is a good example. I think data privacy is another good example. The number of committees in Congress that claim responsibility for data privacy is about, there's 8 committees. The number of committees that claim responsibility for data privacy in the wake of a big data breach is 0. It's this guy's problem, right? And so that's something that I think we're going to have to keep working on, and that your voices and the real life financial situations of students that come into your court or that come into your offices, you're trying to collect on an auto loan, and it's pretty clear to you as a creditor's attorney why it's not getting paid. It's because they're trying to deal with paying their student loans. And so keep at it. I think we need to put more political pressure on this, not in a way that's just pandering to the millennial vote, but in a way that recognizes the systemic economic harm that is being created by all of this outstanding student loan debt.
Yes, thank you very much. What is your biggest source of frustration in your job, and what is the biggest source of satisfaction in your job?
Mm-hmm. So my biggest source of frustration is the calendar and the schedule. So time is all of our most precious commodity, both time in terms of the number of years we have to get things done, but also just hour to hour and minute to minute. Congress does not make good use of its time, and there is a lot that we could do to improve that. So how many of you have one or more appointments on the books for 2020 already? Okay. I don't, because I'm still waiting on the 2020 congressional calendar. So that means I can't book town halls with my constituents in January. That means I can't set appointments to meet with groups like the ABI to talk about things. I can't take speaking engagements. I can't get my kids to see my ex-husband to see their dad. I can't book airline tickets in advance to save taxpayer money. I'm sort of handicapped by that. So I run a Cub Scout pack in Irvine. It was probably one of the most politically useful things I did in getting ready to run. Like I always say, I love Cub Scouts. I don't so much love Cub Scout parents. But my Cub Scout pack put together its annual calendar for 2020 in August. So with all due respect to the majority leader, you're being outgunned by a Cub Scout pack. And you wonder why Congress's approval rating is low. So there's both that problem and then also how we make use of our time. So the fact that we have committee meetings that are constantly in conflict with each other, the fact that the buzzer goes off and we have to go vote, leaving behind a constituent group that may have traveled, in my case, 10 hours at their own expense to get to me, to share their story with me, and I have to walk out of that meeting to go vote and run around. So I walk typically 15,000 steps a day just between Longworth and the Capitol building and the Rayburn building, which are next to each other, for those of you not familiar with the geography of the Capitol. And that tells you how much time is just lost in sort of needless friction. So that's the part that's the most frustrating. And so we're working on that. There's a select committee to modernize Congress. On the Democratic side, the average age of the members of the Select Committee to Modernize Congress is 65. So the struggle is real. The work needs to keep being done. But I want to say that is a bipartisan committee, 6 Republicans, 6 Democrats, 1 staff. No Republican staff, no Democrat staff, no committee chairman and ranking member. Instead, they're just co-chairs. They have issued 29 unanimous recommendations to improve and modernize the operation of Congress to better serve the American people. So you don't hear a lot about that, but this is the first time a select committee has ever produced any recommendation, much less 29 unanimous ones in 10 months. So there are some really good positive things that are happening. So that's my biggest frustration. My greatest joy are my colleagues in the freshman class. I came in with a huge class of freshmen, and what's really terrific about us is that we did not grow up wanting to be in Congress, and we didn't kind of claw our way up through the political ladder. We are nurses and public school teachers. We are veterans. We are nonprofit executives. We are all different kinds of people from all different walks of life, pediatricians, bankruptcy lawyers, and that energy that we have brought to Congress across the ideological spectrum of freshmen is really the greatest joy, because if we're going to build up the American people's confidence in government, and in Congress in particular, we're going to do it by electing a more diverse set of voices that comes in, that are a lot closer to where Americans' real lived experiences are. And so that is the best thing about being in Congress is those folks.
Yesterday we heard that a lot of the bankruptcy legislation that has been passed has been bipartisan. Who are some of your Republican colleagues who you enjoy working with?
Yeah, so there's a freshman named Van Taylor from Texas who's really, really terrific. The freshman class president, Mark Green, is going to distribute the letter, I wrote a letter about the calendar and how to fix this dysfunction. He's going to distribute that to the freshmen as well. Mr. Timmons, who's from South Carolina, who's a Republican on the Financial Services Committee, crunched the numbers to figure out exactly how many hours we spend traveling versus doing meaningful work, either in Washington or in the district, which is, will not share that depressing statistic with you. So those are some of the people this is probably going to surprise most of you, I actually get along really well with Mark Meadows. I don't agree with Mr. Meadows, but he is a lively individual. When I don't know how to vote on a bill and I have a technical question and the clock is ticking, the first person I go find is Justin Amash, because he is the most meticulous preparer for floor votes of any member of Congress in terms of how he digs in and how the rigor of his preparation to understand each vote he's taking. I will say that I probably shouldn't say this, but I do have a least favorite Republican right now, and it's a member of Financial Services Committee who asks every single witness, including Jamie Dimon and Jerome Powell, if they are a socialist or a capitalist. And this is how he's choosing to use his limited 5 minutes, when he could be asking Mr. Powell about so many important issues relating to the stability and growth of our economy, when he could be asking the CEO of Wells Fargo how they're going to turn around some of the institutional and cultural practices that have been problems, when they could be asking the director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau about the trade-off between investing in consumer literacy and investing in enforcement. He's choosing to ask every single person if they're a socialist or a capitalist, and for the record so far, not one person has said socialist. So he's really just wasting the time that the American people have entrusted to him. And I think that kind of conduct I'm not there for. But I think, I enjoy a wide range of my colleagues in terms of intellectual. I mean, being a professor is good training for being in Congress. I mean, it's like one endless faculty meeting from hell. And so the idea that people are going to sit around and disagree with each other endlessly just for the sake of disagreeing, which is what happens every time the faculty ever tries to do anything at any of the 7 institutions I've worked at, that part of Congress feels pretty familiar. But I enjoy my colleagues across the ideological spectrum. I think the divides are more about whether we're willing to take on the status quo and whether we're willing to call out some of the problems that we see in Washington. And I see people from both parties who are willing to sometimes do that work. And that's something that I don't know that those dots get connected for the American people in a very visible way.
Hi, Katie Stutch with the Wall Street Journal. Do you support venue reform? Have you been asked to sign on to HR 4421, and do you intend to do that?
Yep, so I have definitely, thank you everyone, for either lobbying me for or against bankruptcy reform. So I have been asked. I've not decided, and I'll just say a little bit about what I'm thinking about. On the one hand, I have long said and been committed to the idea that the public aspect of bankruptcy is really important. The fact that people can see the proceedings, can participate in the proceedings, that we understand that when a company fails, or consumers are having problems in large numbers, that those are things that are affecting communities. They're affecting the tax base. They're affecting the opportunity and the credit and the availability in the area. And so that there's a real need to put these proceedings sort of on some normative level in the communities where they're happening. We have judges and talented judges from all across this country, and we want to continue that. That is one of the real accomplishments of the bankruptcy system, is the incredible talent that we have, the judge level, the trustee level, and the attorney level, in small towns and in large cities. On the other hand, the academic research on the problems created by the sort of concentration of cases in 1 or 2 districts, while I think it was correct at the time, I think there's some evidence that the problem, the concentration may not be abating, but the problems caused by the concentration may be abating. And the question is, to how much is the abatement occurring? And then what about the competing concerns that I just talked about? So I haven't made a final decision on what I'm going to do about that. I do think that this is a debate worth having, and that we should keep pressing on this issue. People from both sides making your voices heard. So I'm also interested in knowing, are there more venue transfer motions than there used to be? I've had some people tell me, oh yes, and they proceed to offer up one example. I've had some people say, absolutely not, and they proceed to tell me about the one case in which they tried to get venue transferred and it didn't work. And so trying to answer some of those questions in a more rigorous way. So I haven't made up my mind, but it is very, very much on my radar.
As someone who often represents Chapter 7 trustees, I hear all the time...
I will give you a raise. Straight up. Like that we need to get done.
Yeah, a rate increase for the no-asset cases. 25 years there's been no increase.
Yep. And I've sat in those 341 meetings doing research, and I have seen how few minutes you're given to do that important work. And in addition to attracting good, high-quality trustees, including attracting the best and brightest to doing that work, the work that trustees do is critical to people's belief in the integrity of the bankruptcy system and the public's perception of integrity. And so when you're told that you have 82 seconds per debtor and you have to spend most of that on verifying their signature and their ID and looking at their, I mean, you're like a TSA agent. Like, is this you? Can I see your ID? Is this your signature? Did you lie on this form? And that's sort of the time that you're allotted per minute. We're weakening the public's perception of how the system works. So I strongly support a fee increase for Chapter 7 trustees, and I think there are ways that we can do that that do not make it even more expensive for bankruptcy debtors to, there are ways that we can also increase access to the bankruptcy system, including some of the things that we've already done, like paying Chapter 7 filing fees through installment, which we can talk about trying to do, that would mitigate some of the downside of an increased fee for Chapter 7 trustees. So good luck with that raise. I give you the same odds that I give myself in Congress, which is to say not high, but I think you should keep pressing on it. Because I think there is bipartisan support. It's just a matter of getting bandwidth in a really, really busy Congress to get it across the finish line. All right, I think I'll stop there. Thank you all so much for having me. I really appreciated it. Thank you.